There is a particular kind of horror in these old stories that has nothing at all to do with wickedness, and everything to do with simply being in the wrong place at exactly the wrong moment. No villain, no deliberate crime, no warning ignored. Only a single ordinary turn down an unfamiliar path that happens, through no fault of the one walking it, to lead somewhere no mortal eye was ever meant to see. This is the story of a skilled and blameless young hunter, beloved by his companions and gifted at the one craft he had spent his whole life mastering, who wandered by pure and innocent accident into a hidden grotto where a goddess happened to be bathing, and who paid for that single unintended glimpse with a transformation so complete and a death so cruel that even some of the old poets who told this story could not resist pausing to ask whether the punishment had truly fit so blameless a crime. This is the story of Actaeon, grandson of the very Cadmus whose founding of Thebes this channel has already told in full. And it belongs, we will see, to a family whose fortunes seemed cursed almost from the moment that first dragon's blood was spilled at a sacred spring. To understand Actaeon, we must recall briefly the story this channel has already told of his grandfather. Cadmus, you will remember, founded the great city of Thebes after killing the dragon that guarded a sacred spring belonging to the god Ares. And though he served his penance and married well and built a city that would endure for centuries, the shadow of that spilled and sacred blood never entirely lifted from his own descendants. We noted when we first told his story that the house of Cadmus would prove to be one of the most cursed and sorrow-laden royal lines in the whole of Greek myth, and that we had already glimpsed in an earlier episode one of its darkest chapters in the tragedy of Oedipus. Actaeon belongs to this same unlucky bloodline, the son of Oedipus, one of Cadmus's own daughters and grandson to the founder himself, and his own story, though it unfolds a generation or two before the horrors that would later befall Oedipus, carries within it the very same sense of a family, perpetually standing just one careless step away from catastrophe, however innocently that step happens to be taken. Actaeon was raised by most of the old tellings in the wild green hills above Thebes, and educated in a detail that should sound familiar to anyone who has followed this channel's earlier stories, by the same wise centaur Chiron who once tutored Jason on Mount Pelion, and who would later, generations further on, raise the young Achilles on that same mountainside before the boy ever sailed for Troy. Chiron's particular gift, this channel has already noted, was for shaping raw and gifted young men into something more disciplined and more complete than raw talent alone could ever produce. And under his careful guidance, Actaeon grew into one of the finest hunters of his entire generation, skilled with the bow and the spear, patient in tracking even the most elusive game across difficult terrain, and beloved, above nearly everything else, by the 50 or so hunting hounds he had raised and trained and named individually, each one loyal to him with the particular and unconditional devotion that only a hound raised from puppyhood by a single steady hand can ever truly offer. It is worth pausing before the catastrophe itself to build a clear picture of exactly the kind of young man Actaeon actually was, because the whole tragedy that follows depends entirely on our understanding that he was, by every honest measure the story offers us, a genuinely good and blameless hunter, not reckless, not impious, not given to any of the boasting or the careless disrespect toward the gods that has doomed nearly every other hero we have followed into similar catastrophe on this channel. He did not, like Niobe, compare himself favorably to any god. He did not, like Arachne, refused to credit divine favor for his own considerable skill. He simply hunted, faithfully and well, with the same 50 hounds at his side day after day, moving through hills and valleys he knew as intimately as any home, doing nothing more remarkable. On the particular afternoon this story turns upon, then following the trail of game a little further than usual, into a part of the forest he had simply never happened to explore before. Picture the ordinary shape of that particular morning, before anything had yet gone wrong. Because the old poets clearly wanted their listeners to feel the sheer unremarkable normalcy of it before the story's single terrible turn, Actaeon rose with his companions at first light, exactly as he had done 100 mornings before, and gathered his hounds, calling each one by the name he himself had given it years earlier, and set out into hills that held, for him, none of the mystery or menace that a stranger might have felt moving through unfamiliar wilderness. This was his own country, walked and re-walked across years of practice, and there was nothing in the ordinary rhythm of that morning's hunt. The scent picked up, the pursuit begun, the pack fanning out exactly as their training had shaped them to, that gave him, or could have given him, any warning at all that this particular chase was about to carry him somewhere. No warning would have been enough to protect him from, anyway. It is worth sitting with that lack of warning, because so many of the tragedies this channel has already followed contained at least some small and ignored signal along the way. A prophecy dismissed, an oracle's caution set aside, a goddess's disguised warning refused outright. Actaeon received no such warning to ignore. There was nothing here for him to have done differently, no earlier fork in the story where a wiser or more cautious man might have turned back and spared himself. That absence is, in its own quiet way, the most unsettling feature of the entire tale. That unfamiliar corner of the forest held a hidden and secluded grotto, deep among the trees, fed by a clear spring that pooled into a natural basin of stone. A place, the old poets tell us, so perfectly sheltered and so entirely private that it had become, over long years, a sacred and secret bathing place for the goddess Artemis herself, patroness of the hunt and of wild places, and for the nymphs who attended her. It was there, on this particular afternoon, that Artemis had come, exactly as she so often did, after a long day of hunting through her own beloved wilderness, to bathe in the cool spring water with her nymphs around her, entirely unclothed and entirely certain, as she had every right to be in a grotto this deeply hidden, that no mortal eye could possibly stumble upon her there. And it was into this same hidden grotto, following the trail of a stag his hounds had picked up, somewhere in the unfamiliar hills, that Actaeon wandered, quite by accident, having no idea whatsoever that he was approaching anything more remarkable than an unfamiliar clearing in the woods. He pushed through the last screen of branches and found himself, without a single moment's warning, standing at the edge of the goddess's own private bathing pool, looking directly at Artemis herself, in a state of complete undress, surrounded by her startled nymphs, all of them frozen for one impossible instant in the shock of an intrusion that had never once, in all the long years this sacred grotto had served as their private refuge, actually happened before. It is worth sitting for a genuinely long moment with exactly what did and did not happen in this encounter, because the old poets themselves clearly wanted their listeners to notice the particular injustice buried inside it, even as the story goes on to punish Actaeon regardless. He did not seek this sight out. He did not creep toward the grotto with any intention of spying on the goddess, and he did not linger once he understood what he had stumbled upon, savoring a glimpse he had no right to. Every honest account of the moment agrees that his arrival was pure accident, the blameless consequence of an afternoon's hunt that happened to lead him somewhere he had simply never had any reason to know was forbidden. He was not Arachne, boasting of a skill she refused to credit anyone else for. He was not Ajax, consumed by a rage he had earned through genuine grievance. He had done nothing at all except follow a stag's trail a little further than he ever had before, and found himself, through no fault of his own reasoning or his own character, looking at something no mortal was ever permitted to see. But intention, in this particular corner of the Greek imagination, mattered a great deal less than the old poet's own audiences might have wished it to. The nymphs around Artemis, seeing the intruder, cried out and rushed instinctively to shield their goddess's body from his gaze with their own. But the damage, in the strict and unforgiving logic of divine sanctity, was already and irreversibly done. Artemis, furious and humiliated at being seen in this most private and vulnerable of moments by any mortal eye at all, regardless of how innocently that eye had come to be there, did not pause to ask Actaeon how he had come to stumble upon her, and did not offer him the chance, as some other and more merciful gods in these old tales have occasionally offered their own accidental transgressors, to explain himself or beg forgiveness. She reached instead for the water of her own sacred spring, and flung a handful of it directly into his face. And as the droplets struck him, Actaeon felt his whole body beginning, immediately and irresistibly, to change. Antlers began to sprout from his forehead, curling up and outward exactly like the very stag he had been tracking only moments before. His neck lengthened, and his skin roughened and darkened into the coarse, dappled hide of a deer, and his hands and feet drew inward and hardened into hooves, until, within the space of a few terrible and disorienting moments, the skilled young hunter who had walked into that grotto on 2 human legs was gone entirely, replaced by a frightened stag standing exactly where he had stood, staring back at the furious goddess with the same wide, uncomprehending eyes any startled deer might show a hunter who had just crossed too close. And here Artemis added one final, and in many ways the cruelest, detail to her curse. She did not merely change his shape. She left his mind, the old poets tell us, entirely intact and entirely human, so that Actaeon understood, with perfect and horrified clarity, exactly what had happened to him and exactly what danger he was now standing in, even as his own throat, reshaped now into a stag's, could produce nothing but a helpless and wordless bleating, utterly unable to call out his own name, or explain himself, or beg for any mercy at all from anyone who might have recognized him. There is a strange and almost unbearable stillness in the instant between the goddess's flung water and the completion of the transformation it set in motion, and the old poets, describing it, seem to have wanted their listeners to feel every single stage of it rather than let the change pass in a single merciful blur. Actaeon felt his own thoughts continuing, uninterrupted and entirely his own, even as the shape carrying those thoughts stopped belonging to him piece by piece. A horror compounded, rather than eased, by exactly how gradually and how completely he was made to witness his own unmaking. He caught sight of his own reflection, some tellings say, in the same spring water that had just been flung into his face, and saw, in the trembling surface, antlers where his own dark hair had been only moments before, and understood, with a clarity no ordinary animal transformation, in these old tales, usually permits its victim, exactly what he had become, and exactly how little of his old self remained to explain it to anyone. He fled from the grotto in raw animal panic, and it was here, in the chase that followed, that the story delivered its final and most unbearable cruelty of all. For Actaeon's own hunting party, the very companions he had set out with that same morning, and his own 50 beloved hounds, the very animals he himself had raised from puppyhood, and trained and loved and fed with his own hands across years of patient devotion, caught the scent of a fleeing stag moving through the forest, and gave chase exactly as they had been trained to do 1,000 times before, with no way at all to recognize that the creature they were now pursuing with such joyful and practiced skill was their own beloved master, transformed beyond any recognition their noses or their eyes could offer them. Stay with this image for a moment, because it is the whole and deliberate heart of this particular tragedy, and the old poets clearly meant for it to be unbearable. The very devotion Actaeon had spent years carefully cultivating in his own hounds, the loyalty, the discipline, the trained and eager instinct to run down whatever fleeing creature their master pointed them toward, became, in a single terrible reversal, the precise instrument of his own destruction. His hounds did not fail him through any fault of their own. They did exactly what he himself had taught them to do, with exactly the skill and the devotion he had spent years instilling in them. And it was that very skill and that very devotion that finally ran him to ground, exhausted and cornered, deep in the same forest he had hunted through so many times before, as their master rather than their prey. And his human companions, arriving on the scene and finding their hounds triumphantly pulling down a magnificent stag, are said, by some of the darker tellings, to have called out for Actaeon himself to come and see the fine kill his own pack had made, never once suspecting, even as the hounds tore into the dying animal, that the master they were calling for was already lying beneath his own loyal creature's jaws, unable to speak a single word to tell them so. It would be difficult to imagine a crueler shape for this particular death, and it is worth asking, plainly, exactly what lesson the old Greeks who told and retold this story across so many centuries believed it was actually teaching. Some of the ancient tellers themselves seem to have wrestled openly with the same discomfort a modern listener feels hearing it, offering, in certain later versions, small mitigating details meant to soften the sheer injustice of it, that's suggesting, in some tellings, that Actaeon had in fact boasted afterward, however briefly, that he had seen the goddess more clearly than any mortal ever had, a claim that would at least give Artemis's fury some more familiar and recognizable target, some echo of the pride that doomed Niobe or Arachne, rather than pure and blameless accident. But the oldest and most widely repeated version of the story offers no such comfort. Actaeon simply saw what he was never meant to see, entirely by chance, and paid for that chance with everything he had. There is a particular kind of theology hiding inside this uncomfortable insistence, one worth sitting with honestly, rather than explaining away, because it tells us something true about how the old Greeks actually understood the boundary between the mortal and the divine. The sacred, in this understanding, was not dangerous because it was cruel, exactly, but because it was simply and absolutely other, governed by its own laws of purity and privacy that had nothing whatsoever to do with human notions of fairness or intention, and violating those laws, even by pure accident, still meant crossing into territory where the ordinary human excuse of, "I did not mean to," carried no weight at all. It is the same principle, in a different and gentler key that runs through the story of the underworld this channel has already told. A set of laws that governs the boundary between worlds and that holds regardless of whether the mortal crossing them fully understood what they were doing. Actaeon's tragedy is the starkest and most unforgiving expression of that same principle we have yet followed on this channel, that some boundaries do not bend for good intentions, however genuinely and completely blameless those intentions actually were. And yet the story does not ask us to simply accept this without any discomfort at all. And it is worth noticing exactly where that discomfort has always lived across the centuries. This myth has been retold. Ovid himself, whose telling of this story remains the most influential version to survive into later ages, pauses at the very moment of Actaeon's transformation to ask, in his own poet's voice, whether this could truly be called justice, whether an accident of the trail, an innocent wandering into an unfamiliar clearing, genuinely deserved a punishment this total and this cruel. It is a rare and telling moment in the whole of ancient mythology, a poet stepping back from his own story to question openly whether the goddess he is describing has behaved justly at all. And he offers no clean answer, because the old myths themselves rarely offer one. They simply show us the shape of a world in which some lines, once crossed, cannot be uncrossed by any appeal to fairness, however much that unfairness might trouble the very storyteller recounting it. We might notice, too, how this story continues the pattern this channel first identified when we told the founding of Thebes, a family whose fortunes seem to curve, generation after generation, toward exactly this kind of unearned catastrophe. Cadmus killed a sacred dragon in self-defense and spent 8 years atoning for it, regardless of the necessity behind the act. Actaeon glimpsed a goddess by pure accident and paid for it with his life within a single afternoon. And this channel has already told you, in an earlier episode, of the darker reckoning still waiting further down this same bloodline, in the story of Oedipus, where a curse he never knowingly earned unfolds with the same terrible and unbending logic across an entire life. It is as though the blood spilled at that first sacred spring never fully finished asking to be repaid, finding new and innocent descendants across each succeeding generation to extract some further and unasked for payment from, regardless of how blamelessly each of them happened to live their own particular portion of the family's long and unbroken debt. And so we return, at the end, to the question this quiet and unsettling story was built to ask, a question with no comfortable answer waiting at the bottom of it. What do we owe to boundaries we did not know existed? And how much mercy does good intention actually earn us when we cross them anyway? Actaeon did nothing wrong by any ordinary human measure of guilt or innocence. He hunted well, he trained his hounds with genuine care and devotion, and he wandered, on one particular afternoon, into a clearing he had no way of knowing was forbidden to him. And none of that saved him, because the world these old stories describe was never built entirely around fairness in the way we might wish it to be. It was built around boundaries that held regardless of who crossed them or why, and around a sacredness that demanded, sometimes, a payment far larger than any accidental trespasser could reasonably be expected to owe. Rest now. Let the hidden grotto settle back into its long and undisturbed privacy, the spring running clear and quiet once more, and somewhere in the forest beyond it. If you listen closely in these last moments, before sleep finally finds you, let the old hounds, their hunt long finished, lie down at last and rest.